Hello, and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. In this episode of our Energy and Infrastructure podcast series, we are talking about the Biden administration's climate change policies and their potential impact on the energy industry. I'm Omar Nazif, a project finance partner in the San Diego office.
And I'm Lauren Anderson, a corporate partner in the Houston office. This is obviously a really important topic and one that continues to evolve. And so we're really excited to be joined today by Janice Schneider and Nikki Buffa to help us unpack some of the key points.
Janice is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office and the global vice chair of Latham's Environment, Land, and Resources Department. She is also the former assistant secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the Department of the Interior.
Thanks, Omar. It's great to be here.
And Nikki is a counsel in our Orange County and Washington, D.C. offices. She served in the Obama White House in several positions and is a former deputy chief of staff at the Department of Interior.
Thanks for having us.
Janice and Nikki both have deep expertise in this area and experience working in the federal government, which gives them terrific insight into these topics.
Let's go ahead and dive in. Janice, Nikki, why don't you guys start by giving us a lay of the land? Can you give us like a 1,000-foot view of the administration's priorities right now?
Sure, you bet. I'm sure we're going to go into this in more detail as we get going, but Cliff Notes version basically is climate, climate, climate. Really, in terms of both reducing all manner of greenhouse gas emissions, improving climate resilience, and really aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement, using all the tools of the federal government. This is a significant reprioritization of policies and goals from the prior administration. And these changes are going to reverberate throughout all of the agencies and actions taken by the Biden-Harris administration. It's going to be one of the lenses, and a super major one at that, that's going to inform everything from domestic agency actions to financing to international climate diplomacy. So what this means is we're going to be seeing more emphasis on funding and developing carbon capture technologies like CCS and direct air capture, and a very deliberate transition away from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources like solar and wind, battery storage, and offshore wind. And we're also going to start to see a lot more emphasis on research and developing energy from hydrogen.
Thanks, Janice. That's really interesting. Nikki, from a practical perspective, what are some of the key areas the Biden administration is expected to focus on to implement these climate change policy goals?
This administration has said many times that utilizing a whole government approach to the pressing issues this country is facing, including climate, energy, and environmental policy, is really the way to go. And the administration is engaging domestically and internationally to reset all of the international commitments that have been made by the previous administration. So we're seeing the United States rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. We're seeing Special Envoy Kerry traveling around the world. He's already engaging in international climate diplomacy, even before Secretary of State Blinken has actually traveled anywhere. So Kerry's been to the EU. He's met with the president of the EU. He's met with the British Prime Minister. And then we know that there are these future actions coming up, like the Glasgow summit in November, COP26, where we're again going to see the United States kind of resetting its goals and policies on international climate.
Before we go any further, you mentioned John Kerry was appointed as a special envoy. Is that a newly created role?
Yeah, it is a new role, and it's not the only new role that they've created. The administration has also created a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy with a National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. And that office is coordinating and implementing all the domestic climate policy decisions. And they've got a National Climate Task Force, it's cabinet level, which is chaired by Gina McCarthy, the climate advisor, to organize and deploy a government-wide approach to combating climate change. There are 21 members of the task force, and that includes, cabinet secretaries and heads of key White House offices like the Office of Management and Budget and the Council on Environmental Quality. They're each required to prioritize actions on climate change in policymaking and the budget process, contracting and procurement. So we're seeing a lot of new people, new titles, and new systems to kind of combat climate change government-wide.
Yeah, and this, Janice, let me jump in here. All I can say is stay tuned. Earth Day is rapidly coming upon us, April 22nd. And I'm sure there's going to be some big announcements by the administration in advance of the Global Climate Summit that is going to be taking place on Earth Day this year.
Yeah, the administration has really big goals on climate. They're aiming for a carbon-free power sector by 2035 and to achieving 100% clean energy, net zero emissions by 2050. So this means they're going to do things like, measuring and reducing GHG emissions, reestablishing the social cost of carbon, both nitrous oxide and methane, to quantify the social benefits of reducing carbon emissions, which will be used during the regulatory review process. When they're assessing the benefits and the costs of a particular regulation, now they have a way to actually figure in the cost of climate. That's really going to, I think, move the needle. They're talking a lot about bolstering resilience to the impacts of climate change. This is everything from where the FEMA flood maps are to how you're funding large infrastructure projects, where you're actually going to put those infrastructure projects, making sure we're making smart decisions about where federal money is being spent in the face of an ever-changing climate. And then they're going to use the federal procurement power, the power of the purse, to direct federal grants and loans to invest in these very climate-friendly sectors and projects, and to procure renewable energy or build renewable energy projects on federal land within, for instance, certain military bases throughout the country.
So what this means is we're going to start to see really what I'd characterize as a deeper decarbonization of the U.S. economy. And so that means a transition from the uses of fossil fuel to a cleaner energy economy, and with a added focus on electric infrastructure improvement. So we're going to see a lot more electric vehicle deployment, a lot more R&D and battery technology, a lot more grid infrastructure improvements and enhancements. And along with that, and we're already seeing this, the administration is placing limits on fossil fuel leasing and development on public lands and waters. The administration has stated that about 25% of all GHG comes from fossil fuel use associated with the public lands. And so they are looking very closely at that. And at the same time, a couple of other big administration goals is to use this energy transition to help create well-paying union jobs, as well as prioritize environmental justice and providing investment to disadvantaged and underserved communities, particularly in regard to climate finance and in the rulemaking process.
That's really interesting, Janice. And I'd be curious to know, there have obviously already been a number of executive orders that have been issued by the administration. And I think the general expectation is that there are going to be more to come. Can you give us a sense of how these new regulations or anticipated regulations are likely to further influence, I guess, from a commercial perspective, the transition to renewable energy in a low carbon economy?
Sure. Well, there's a significant focus on the oil and gas sector, and this is very, very different from how the Trump administration approached the sector previously. The administration, and in particular the Interior Department, has already initiated a regulatory review of Trump administration actions. EPA is looking at fuel economy standards as well as the air rules related to fossil-fired power generation facilities and methane reduction, which I think is going to be big, big, big. The president has also already paused oil and gas leasing for new leases on federal lands and waters, meaning the outer continental shelf, and has placed a temporary moratorium on leasing activities in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Interior is going to be conducting a comprehensive review. So there's going to be a very significant focus in all of these areas related to how do we bring our carbon footprint down here in the United States.
Yeah, and then on renewables, there's also been a number of executive orders that have directed, for instance, the Secretary of the Interior to review the siting and permitting processes on federal lands and waters to identify steps that can be taken to increase renewable energy production on those lands. These executive orders contain both a 2035 goal and a 2050 goal. And there's a ton of other kind of very forward-leaning directives in these executive orders, including the establishment of the National Climate Task Force that we talked about earlier. And what you can see is there's, again, this whole of government approach to addressing these issues. And while there's a lot of focus on renewable energy development, particularly on federal land, there are some other objectives in these executive orders. One in particular, it's called the 30 by 30 objective, which might run headlong, against the renewable energy production goals. This 30 by 30 goal, for instance, it actually directs the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture and Commerce, because of NOAA, to achieve a goal of conserving 30% of public lands and waters by 2030. And there's a lot of federal land, there's a lot of federal water, there should be room for everything, but it's interesting to kind of, when you stack up all these goals together, to begin to think about potential conflicts. And one of the things we know is that this administration is actually going to follow the Obama administration's smart from the start approach to deconflicting these federal lands and waters. So for instance, you'll see the Bureau of Land Management looking at things like the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan as a framework for ensuring that future renewable energy projects are sited in places that have been deconflicted, that have been essentially set aside or zoned for renewable energy development, to make sure that those are the right places for big solar, big wind projects, and not necessarily the right places for conservation or recreational use.
That's absolutely right. And, on the offshore, we're going to see a lot of renewable energy development there as well. I mean, this is a brand new industry here in the United States, and it's really quite exciting. The administration is, in my view, going to significantly accelerate offshore wind projects on the outer continental shelf, and they're working really closely with states in order to do that. And states are super interested in this program area, particularly along the East Coast, where they're already procuring and contracting for large amounts of offshore wind to meet the state's renewable energy targets. And more importantly, bring jobs and develop manufacturing and supply chains and port infrastructure to each of their states. And it's been very interesting to watch, because there's like a little competition going on between the states about, who can do better in this area. The clean energy potential from offshore wind is absolutely enormous. The federal government estimates that the technical output of areas they've already identified as plausible areas for offshore wind development is over 60 gigawatts of power. And just for some perspective, Hoover Dam has a capacity of 2 gigawatts of power and serves the electrical needs for millions of people.
Wow, that is really exciting. We're also seeing a lot of interest from our clients in the project finance community on offshore wind. So we're going to be taking a deeper dive into that in one of our upcoming podcasts.
I guess one last question, if you guys still have a few minutes before we wrap up, can you give us a sense of what else the industry should be looking out for, or anything else of note that we expect to be coming down the pike?
EJ, environmental justice. There's just a really new federal government focus on environmental justice, and they refer to it as Justice 40. One of the things they're looking at is how can some of the federal benefits, so some of this federal money that's going to be spent on the new clean energy economy, how can some of those benefits actually go to disadvantaged communities? So they've set this goal that 40% of those monies and those benefits end up in environmental justice communities, and they're calling that the Justice 40 initiative. And the plan is written out in Executive Order 1408. And the promise is that OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Council on Environmental Quality, and the National Climate Advisor will together publish these recommendations on just how to do this. So one of the things that you'll see is greater definitions around what are disadvantaged communities, what are benefits. These are all definitions that they're going to need to figure out in order to implement this really laudable goal. There's also a scorecard component to what the administration is looking to do. They're going to actually start scoring agencies on their environmental justice performance. And I just want to note here that they've actually hired a particular person to be a White House official that focuses just on environmental justice. So it kind of shows how serious they are about these commitments. And then I'll just say, there's going to be an increased focus on union jobs. I mean, President Biden is certainly a union guy. He sees great importance in ensuring union involvement in major project development and in policy development. And we are going to see the unions pressuring the president and the administration when it comes to renewable energy jobs, because historically, the renewable sector hasn't been the most unionized of the energy sectors. So we will see some increased pressure being placed by the unions on the president.
This has been really insightful. Thank you so much for your time, Janice and Nikki. And thank you to our listeners for checking out this episode of the Energy and Infrastructure Podcast in our Connected with Latham series. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon, where we'll cover other key topics in the evolving energy and infrastructure sector. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcast on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham and Watkins, LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham and Watkins, LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham and Watkins, LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things, and you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham and Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham and Watkins, LLP, 885 3rd Avenue, New York, New York, 10022-4834. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.